obviously get an understanding of how the existing processes worked, how they could adapt them to the new registry, and then whether there was obviously opportunities to make improvements, right? Obviously, you don't want to just cut and paste things that are not working properly, right?
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I get to sit down with different BPM practitioners, whether they're working internally, whether they're coming in from that consulting perspective, or whether they look at the BPM world from more of that academic or that research focus. But today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Heath Kingham. Now, Heath is a business analyst at BT Financial Group, and as a business analyst, he's involved with their processes in relation to change, implementation, maintenance. So I'm really excited for this conversation today. I think that you're going to glean a lot of value from it. So Heath, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. Pleasure to be aboard.
Great. So what we might do to kick us off with is, obviously that was a very brief introduction, maybe so that our audience has a bit of a grid and understanding of your history and background. Where did your interest in process management first began, and take us on a journey leading up to what you're doing today?
Yeah, no worries. So basically, with my career at BT, I'd worked in a lot of operations roles. And had always been interested in, how we do things better, how do things work, and those types of, process-driven type thoughts. And it was, I was actually involved in part of a project where they were looking at moving one of my processes to another registry system, right? So it was a lot of, interviews and stuff like that and workshops, trying to uncover, how does this process work? Can we cut and paste it to another type of system, and what's the impact, or should we do things better? And so that was a couple of BAs I was actually working with. And that kind of piqued my interest, like, okay, what is this job like? How do you get into this type of work, right? I've always just been stuck with, this is the process and this is how it works.
Right.
So that kind of piqued my interest in terms of that world of work, and basically had a chat with them. How do I get into this role? And they advised me to start thinking about process analysis. So I actually took up a role in process analysis on a large scale project. They were looking at basically building a whole brand new registry system, and they needed people to obviously get an understanding of how existing processes worked, how they could adapt them to the new registry, and then whether there was obviously opportunities to make improvements, right? Obviously, you don't want to just cut and paste things that are not working properly, right? So that was my involvement to, I guess, process analysis and the management and maintenance of processes. I did that for probably about 12 months, and then actually moved into the business analyst world. So just, it's a similar type of work. It's just a bit more, abstract thinking and stuff like that. So that's how, and I've been doing that for probably about 5 years now as a business analyst, and do similar types of things as you were saying. So I'm obviously looking at, it's either process change or system change. So we look at opportunities. Do we upgrade the technology, or do we improve the process? So,
That's great. And I think a big question to ask is, what's the why behind process? I think, some organizations, as we talked about before we got started with the interview, they'll 2, 3, 5 years ago, they'll spend all this time, effort and energy documenting for documenting's sake. They'll forget why they began documenting in the first place, and they'll complete some of them will complete the work, and they'll look back on that piece of work and be like, why did we do all of that in the first place? So talk to us about what's the why behind understanding and managing your business processes. Why should organizations give that some thought?
Yeah, so I think it's critical. You obviously want to get return for investment, right? So if you're going to spend time and resources on implementing processes, you need to obviously keep these things tracking along and maintaining, right? You're always going to look for opportunities for improvement. There may be pain points in your process that you're not aware of. And I think business process management is a great way to highlight those potential opportunities or pain points, because that's going to have an impact on the financial aspects of your business as well as your customer base, right? So they're just good opportunities to try and strengthen your processes, which is in the long run, it may cost you money up front, but in the long run, you're generally going to get some kind of benefit out of it.
Yes, yep, that's good. And talking about challenges that an organization may face when adopting BPM, whether it started small and it started on a project level and all of a sudden the BPM sort of spread across the organization, which has happened in some companies, or whether it's something where, a new leadership was brought in and they mandated BPM across the organization because they'd seen it work at their previous organization. What are some of the biggest challenges an organization will face when trying to understand or manage or improve their business processes?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few things, right? Like you've got your blockers, I guess, into this being successful. So some of the things, obviously, we kind of touched on was like once the build's finished and the warranty period's over and things like that, people start to lose track and don't revisit these things.
Right.
You really need to think of this as like an end-to-end journey.
Mhm.
It's not just a technology release.
Right.
You got to think of it like what's happening the whole life cycle.
Mm.
Other things as well is like, the trust of your end users and stuff like that. How do you get them to buy in and use these things effectively? That's
Mm.
kind of what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And just on that topic of buy-in, because you're right, you need to get buy-in from the process practitioners. You need to get buy-in from the executive level as well. That you need to get buy-in from the organization if it's going to be adopted, and not just adopted for a season, but adopted sustainably long term. So how do you go about getting buy-in from the process practitioners?
Yeah, so maybe as an executive level, you're looking at like keeping it simple in terms of like what your presentations are and your pitches, highlighting opportunities. What are the real problems the business is facing, and showing that, and showing how BPM can help them in that aspect of their business.
Right.
Um, and then obviously, like, I think you also really want to understand what's the actual unhappy path here of this implementation you're looking at, because these are
Mm.
the questions you're going to get asked by sponsors. Why are we spending this money on this? What happens when something goes wrong? And then you obviously want to be able to answer those questions, not just answer them, but also explain how do you mitigate those unhappy paths from occurring, and then how do you turn them into opportunities.
Great. So when an organization they looking to adopt BPM, but I guess a question that I guess particularly the executive team will have is, well, what is the return on investment, and what's the value we're going to see from this, and how long is it going to take? And I think talking in theory is good, but it'd be really interesting to hear from you whether you've got any experiences, or any experiences come to mind, or any stories or examples come to mind where an organization has adopted BPM, and however simple or complex that might be, whether it's a simple process that they've tweaked, or whether it is a large radical innovation they've done. Do you have any examples that come to mind where, an organization has adopted BPM and they've seen significant value for their organization?
Yeah, definitely. So the place I work, it's heavily process driven in terms of like we're processing transactions, right? So and we process at an extremely high volume. So what our business is looking, or was looking for ways to do, was how do you track that information? How do you use it as a sales pitch almost? And how do you ensure that your business is running as efficiently as possible?
Mm.
So we do a lot in superannuation and finance. So we're doing lots, like I said, lots of transactions coming through and requests that need to be actioned, right? So you need to be able to resource appropriately. You
Mm-hmm.
also need to know when you're not delivering on your customers' expectations, because that's one of the most important things for us, right? Is the customer satisfaction. Customers trying to make a transaction, you need to do it as quickly, as efficiently, and as accurately as you can, right?
Yes.
To create that relationship and keep it ongoing, right? Because there's other competitors in the market, right?
That's right.
So that's the big driver for our business, and the BPM we kind of implement is all around transaction time, right? So what's the life cycle of a transaction? How long does it take for us to get from point A to point Z, and how many people have to put their hands on it? And obviously we create a lot of dashboards off the back of that. And then we can easily identify pain points in processes. If we've set a benchmark, why is this process taking longer? So let's say there's a typical task that's a 3-day task, right? But our statistics are showing, like through diagnostics, that that's taking 5 days. Why? Do we need more staff? Is it really a 5-day task, or what's going on there? So then we can really start diving in. And I think, while some smaller companies may not need that level of detail, as a large organization, it's the only way we can really interrogate what we're doing and if we're doing it efficiently. So, it's ways to identify opportunities. It reduces a lot of your costs in the long run because you can identify ways to do things quicker. And then obviously it's a sales pitch, right? So when you're going to people that may want to use your business, you've obviously got clear stats that you can say, this is how long we take to process your requests. This is our accuracy of our transactions. You can be very transparent about it. And then what happens when we make mistakes? How do we fix it? This is the other evidence.
Yes.
In that respect. And it's measurable, right? It's measurable. You can take that. It's easy to get funding because you can go, here's the current stats. This is the impact of changing this process. And that's what the cost per transaction changes to.
Yes. And I think, for an organization that is doing many transactions a day, thousands, if not tens of thousands of transactions, you can realize or see significant value from a minor tweak to a process, because if that process is happening tens of thousands of times a day, if you tweak it just slightly, that adds up. That's going to significantly reduce a lot of costs or time. That'll allow you to redeploy resources. There's a lot of value that can come from just a minor tweak.
Exactly. And that drives to things like people looking for automation, a lot of straight through processing as well. It's kind of like what lots of businesses want to do. Obviously, you just need to be careful what you're doing there, and depending on the transaction types, you still want to make sure you have some type of governance and oversight, especially with automation, because you can run the risk of making mistakes that just get compounded, right? Because no one's ever picked them up. So yes, you can use these types of things to save money, increase efficiencies, but you do need to make sure that things are done accurately in terms of the governance and the maintenance, keeping on top of these things. Are there any types of DQ reports or data quality reports that you can monitor and look for anomalies and stuff like that before they become massive problems?
Yes. And you also mentioned there about customer expectations, and what is the customer journey that they're going on? What are the tasks or the activities that you're trying to walk them through? And what is that customer experience? And I think sometimes that can be harder for an organization to understand, because if you're looking at your internal processes, what's going on, what the tasks, or you should know what the tasks you are doing in order to sort of deliver that value. But from the customer's point of view, what is the process they're going on? Are they calling up multiple times because they're never quite getting through to the right person? Or that sign-up form, is that redirecting them to the wrong place? Or is it taking them longer than really what it should? So talk to us about, I guess, the customer process or the customer journey. And are you involved in that at BT? Do you have any involvement there, or if not, what is your sort of experience in that customer journey side of things?
Yeah, so when we're looking at creating new processes, off the back of change or new technology, that's a key focus we do as BAs. We heavily look at customer journeys. What's the end-to-end, life cycle of this transaction, starting from the customer has a request, and then you're looking at wait times, handoffs. What's the impact to that person while they're waiting for your transaction to occur? And I think they're great tools like, customer journey mapping and stuff like that, because it really highlights, it's a lot of empathy. Like, you put yourself in the customer's shoes about, how would I feel about how long this transaction's taking? How would I feel, if it could be improved? Like, what are the benefits? So yeah, that's heavily something we do as business analysts. We're always looking for things from the customer's lens. And remember as well, like, your internal people are customers as well, right? So if we're making changes to systems or processes, that has an impact on staff who are our customers as well. So we can't lose sight of that. So it's always having that front of mind and thinking about how you would like to be going through that interaction, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's really important to put yourself into their shoes. How would they be, I guess, receiving this change? If it's an internal customer, as you've been saying, if you're going to be changing that process that they've been doing the same way for the last 2, 3, 5 years, and you're now going to change it, and I think sometimes, that can be. That's a whole task in itself. Is how do you bring them along for the journey, so that they feel empowered, they feel like they've been included in the change. It's not that you're just coming in there and being like, well, you've been doing it that way, but you're going to be doing it this way now, and they're kind of like, what, I've got to learn a new system, or I've got to learn a new process, or what was wrong with what I've always been doing. So.
Yeah, it is a big challenge, right? And it's particularly because you can have some sticky situations about what the change you're delivering is, right? A lot of the times those changes can be directly impacting someone's role. So they're quite challenging. We use change managers and things like that to help with those types of things. But I think as soon as you use that customer journey lens, it just puts everyone at ease. Like, it's kind of like, we're doing the right thing. It's all about doing the right thing, right? And maybe sometimes there's no need for the change, and that may be uncovered when you do the customer journey, right? It might be, well, there's no real benefit of doing this. Like, the customer's okay. Like, the customer likes the fact that we're spending this time to make sure the transaction's accurate. So maybe we shouldn't reduce the time because it increases risk.
Right.
There's types of things you just need.
Yeah. And how do you identify critical processes? Because I think, there would be people listening to this, or will be listening to this, that they don't have a very process centric way of managing their organization, or delivering value. They don't understand their processes, or they don't manage them very well at the moment. So I guess for this organization that's in the very early days, or that they're still learning, how do you identify where should they direct their attention? How do you identify which are the important processes to focus on now, and which are the ones that it's not going to, we won't see a huge amount of value come from anything from that process?
Yeah, so I think you first need to understand what you're delivering to your customer and what is of importance to them, right? So what is the key of all the transactions you're doing, what ones are the most important to your customer? And if they don't work, will have a negative impact on the relationship and possibly lose that business, right? So that's the first step, is identifying what those processes and transactions are, and then working out how do you measure them, and how do you look for opportunities to maintain and improve them where possible. From the back of that, then it's just a bit of basic stack ranking, I guess. Like, you're looking at what are other opportunities that come out of when you've been following BPM, what other opportunities are around, and what kind of value are they going to add. You can make that decision depending on what other priorities you've got. But yeah, I think the first step is work out what's the deal breaker. Like, what's going to cause your customer to just go, no, that's not good enough. And if you know those things and you can stay on top of them, that's how you start to move things along and make other improvements where you can.
Yes, great. And talk to us about, I guess, that balance, or that difference between focusing on existing processes and making those incremental improvements, and then looking for radical innovation. How are we going to create the future, and what are the new processes that we've never done before, but this is the way that we should be moving forward? I think, especially over the last 5-10 years, we're seeing huge industries getting disrupted by small startups, which forces large organizations to, well, if you're not going to disrupt yourself, if you're not going to create the future, then someone else will. And it might be a small startup that makes things really tough for you. So is that a big part of your role, I guess, the innovation side of things? And how do you balance between the incremental versus the radical?
Yeah, so in a large organization, it can be hard because you're quite hamstrung in terms of nice to have projects. You can generally be directed about what type of work you're looking at due to like regulation or legislation change, right? So they're your core things you're looking at for process change and improvements. Is there's been a legislation change that's going to impact to our business, so we need to make sure that we're compliant, otherwise we can't operate. So
Yes.
I think you just need to have that right mindset to use those changes as gate openers, like opportunities, right? So if there's a legislation change that impacts your business, is there anything else that you're thinking of that is similar to that you can kind of piggyback in and implement those changes at the same time, because you're going to have to do something anyway. But it does become very hard for these like nice to have opportunities in large business just because of those regulatory things, right? But that doesn't mean you stop thinking about them, right? And when you talk about disruptors, I think that's great for the industry, right? Because someone else has the time and they're less hamstrung to be able to come up with those ideas. And then that starts your thought processes internally about how do we do that? How did they come up with that?
Right.
So it's not always a bad thing, right?
True.
It's almost like they're fostering ideas for you. So that's the challenge I see it with like big business. Like unless you've got the resources to actually have people dedicated to continuous like change and improvement, which then that's great, right? You've got the resources to do that. And then maybe that's the question as to whether you should just have that department, right? And bite the bullet and spend that cost for a long-term goal, right? Because that's a long-term dream,
True.
I guess, to be able to spend that money up front looking for, opportunities that may not be around at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about process maintenance. I know that we have mentioned that there are organisations out there that they'll embark on such a big exercise. Maybe one of their main competitors started documenting their processes and making improvements and things like that. That they notice that they try to adopt that. Maybe they bite off more than they can chew. Maybe they don't have the right resources. The culture's not right. Maybe they they don't have the right process ownerships or things like that. And then they get to a point where, they scrap that piece of work, or they come to the end of that piece of work and they're like, well, why do we do that again? Like, where was the value in that? Talk to us about process maintenance and I guess the value or the importance in maintaining those those processes that you have there, and not just letting them sit there and collect dust.
Yeah, so that comes back to how you're using the data you're collecting, right? So you want to be able to have a look at your data collecting around like what are the stats, what are you actually delivering, and then you can revisit certain pain points, right? So that's about having important, like up-to-date and accurate process documentation and mappings, right? So if you see a pain point on your dashboard, so to speak, in terms of where a process is faltering, if you don't have it documented, it's a bit hard to understand what changes you need to make. So that's another key thing is that big organizations can face, is when you have so many processes and so many forced changes on your business, how do you keep track of what the actual documentation is and who should have access to it? And then it comes down to a trusting as well, right? So you can have all these processes in place and you documented everything to the nth degree, but as soon as a process changes and it isn't updated, the people that use those processes no longer have trust in the documentation, right? And then you're bringing all sorts of risk into your business because people aren't following a documented process. They're following things that they've kind of like learned from someone else, or I've found a way to get this to work, and that becomes quite dangerous. So it's you need to really monitor what you're doing, and then have accurate and up-to-date documentation that people can use as a library, because it's an auditing thing as well, right? You need to be able to stand up and say, this is what we did and this is the process. And it also gives people at a higher up level, in terms of when they're looking at strategic decisions, how that's going to impact their business, if they can clearly track down what that change might have on different business units.
Yeah. And I think that, another thing is, if someone decides to leave the business after 10, 20, 30 years, and if their knowledge has never been documented down, then you're losing a valuable asset that's just walking out the door. And they walk out of the door every single afternoon or every evening. You don't know what's going to happen from now until tomorrow, whether they win the gold lotto or maybe something less fortunate. It's just you want to be able to have that data there, that knowledge, that valuable knowledge stored in a I guess a robust form of memory that's better than our human brains.
Yeah, it's all about reducing key person risk, right? So you're right.
Yeah.
If those people leave or retire, things like that, you really need to make sure your business is protected, and that it's also a good training tool as well, right? Like rather than spending all that money on training materials and getting someone in, you can literally just have that documentation there that people can follow. And that way everyone's doing something consistent, and that just obviously helps with your monitoring as well, right? So there's no point capturing data on how long it takes to do a process if everyone does it 10 different ways.
Yes. Yeah.
You're going to get massive spikes in what's happening, right? So it's just that you're ruling something out that could be wrong, right? So if we're like, why is this process failing? Well, we know people are following the process steps because they're accurate and they're maintained. So what else is it?
Yes. And obviously it's been quite a turbulent year for a lot of organizations, and for some organizations it's played to their favor or to their advantage, or the organizations have adapted and they've entered into new markets, or they're delivering value in a different way now. But how has BPM played a part in this year? Whether an organization didn't have any understanding of their processes, or I guess those organizations that did, what has this year looked like for those organizations that have and haven't?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people could have got caught out in terms of co-located areas, because there's obviously been restricted travel. Also, people are relying on people actually have to physically being at work to complete processes. And when they can't do that, how that has disrupted the industry, right? So that's like I was saying earlier before on the call about how, I'm currently working from home, and that's because only a certain amount of people can go into the office due to the nature of their role. But, we were quite lucky, but a lot of other industries, they just can't go into work at all. So how do you do that, right? So if you need to be at a certain location for, the network you're logged into, or the phone systems and things like that, that's a lot of like big change to deal with, right? A lot of people using places overseas and stuff like that for a lot of their processing, possibly, like Telstra or telephone companies, things like that. They lose a whole heap of their staff, right? Because they just can't go to work. Like, and how are you supposed to continue? So still, I think there's been a lot of things thrown up in the air this year, and there's been a massive spike in obviously digital adoption by customers and businesses. I think there's been a lot of things where sometimes people have been resistant to digital, like concerned about scamming and things like that. But as you can see, Australia Post is inundated at the moment with online shopping, and people have just literally overnight have lost those fears, and everything is, why can't I do this online now? So it'd be interesting how a lot of businesses that have been traditionally brick and mortar and offices as well, right? How they'll adopt and change to just being purely online. It'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely.
And the security comes into it as well, right? Like it's a massive concern at the moment. Like data security, people are collecting so much data they never knew about before, and now they're like, well, what do I do with it? And then who could do something nefarious with it? Right. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, everyone's putting everything online.
That's right. And I guess moving forward into the future, it's just going to be more and more of this. So what trends are you noticing, or what do you think the future looks like if we look at the next 2, 3, 5 years, specifically around the way organizations manage their business processes? Now, obviously every organization is at a different maturity level, and so that they will they will be required to give their attention to different things at different times. But I guess in the broader sense, what are you noticing, and what do you think the future of BPM looks like?
Yeah, so I think there'll be a lot more automation. And then, so that's going to be heavily reliant on security and monitoring, right? So, if you look at banks, for example, like lots of branches are closing because people can't go into the branch just due to restrictions and stuff like that. So that's kind of there's no turnaround after that, right? They're not going to reopen the branch. So it's obviously thinking, okay, well, now that means people are going to be either calling or they're going to be doing stuff online. So now, we need to focus our energy on how do we ensure those two processes aren't going to let us down, because that, like, banking is pretty important to people, right? And when they're not satisfied with their banking, that they'll go elsewhere. So you need to really I think there's going to be a big focus on things like that have purely gone from like a brick and mortar to online. Is how do you maintain and monitor those processes to make sure you're delivering what your core customers want.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Heath, obviously we can only scrape the surface of a number of different topics within 35 minutes, however long it's been. But I know that the audience that are listening, it's great for them to get an insight into an organization that is putting time, effort, and energy into understanding their business processes, what's going on, how do we bring people along for the journey, how do we improve our business processes. I think there's a lot in our conversation that people will be able to glean from, and even if they can take just one thing away, put that into practice, or even if it just sparks one conversation, I think that's going to be really valuable, particularly for an organization that is less an organization that isn't as far along the journey as you guys are. So I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today and sharing your knowledge with me and with the wider community.
No worries. Hopefully had some benefit there.